Hello there, political scientists. Welcome to the next instalment. We're talking about the powers of the Prime Minister. We're talking about how they win, and I guess that means I have to talk about how they lose. Now, I already introduced this in the last video from yesterday, where I suggested that it was down to a quote from Harold Macmillan, who, when asked what defined his power within the role of Prime Minister, as events, dear boy, events. And we learnt that events can often lead a Prime Minister to lose rather than win, despite their obvious power advantages. So, today's lesson, the first of two, will be on looking at how they lose and looking in more detail at those events. We'll see how we go. So, back to it. There it is! It's almost like I never left. I kind of didn't, I guess. I guess I've been here all night. So we were talking about Macmillan's change from Super Mac to Mac the Knife, an insult that he shrugged off and made his own, versus an insult that sort of defined his prime ministerial position. He lost his deft political touch. His attempt to stamp his authority on his cabinet looked petty, vindictive, and a man who was panicking, and as a consequence he looked unstable and was removed. He had emergency surgery and resigned. We don't need to know about the emergency surgery bit. The point is, events played a role in his defenestration, removal of power, how he lost. What I need to do now is return. We're going to talk about Edward Heath. Edward Heath, good old Ted. Edward Heath won a surprise political election, general election in 1970, and did so on the back of having an action plan. He was widely popular, widely liked within his own party, and seemed to offer a difference to the divided Labour Party that his party, the Conservatives, managed to replace. Initially, things went well. He was trying to clamp down on unions. He was trying to build what the Labour Party had failed to build to control unions. They'd suggested something called in place of strife. More on that later. And it had failed. And Heath came in basically and punished the unions because people were angry about strikes. Angrier than initially they appeared. And it looked like he was going to get away with it. But remember, events, dear boy, events. It's not enough to be a good Prime Minister or even well supported. Edward Heath, Ted, was faced with a number of woes. The first of these was OPEC's oil embargo of 1973. This was an international problem. OPEC, the oil-producing company's economic community, decided that they didn't like selling oil for knockdown prices to Western powers that came and told them what to do, and decided to flex their economic muscles. This gun is called non-existent, and this one isn't even a gun. But OPEC actually had guns. They had muscles, sinew, economic sinew, and they simply blockaded the West, thereby producing a sort of uptick in the price of oil. And when I say uptick, I do mean on that sort of level. Suddenly, oil was really, really expensive, having been, well, dirt cheap. And now, countries couldn't deal. You can see the photograph down there of a UK petrol station saying, sorry, no petrol. People started riding horses. Cars stopped being useful. The price of oil meant that you couldn't make fertilizer as easily. Food prices went up. Distribution costs went up for goods, meaning all prices started to rise. It had a massive effect on what we call inflation, the rate at which the price of living rises higher than the prices rise, than salaries rise, payments rise. So inflation, if it's positive, means that prices are rising quicker than wages. It's as simple as that. If wages stay the same. As my wages have been frozen again as a teacher, and they were frozen previously for a decade, it means that basically an inflation of, say, 3 to 4%, that's roughly what we're experiencing, means that I take a 3 to 4% pay cut every year if my wages stay the same. That's how it works. That's why people go on strike for pay increases. And sure enough, inflation was already a bit of an issue, and there were already strikes. Remember, he said he was going to punish the unions. And so in 1972, and again in 1973, coal miners went on strike to basically say, Yabu sucks, to being punished. In 1973, inflation was rising, and they wanted to raise their wages to match or beat it so that they could earn more money or more cost of living increases. He said no, And the union said, fine, we'll bring you down. And he said, I don't think so. Then OPEC did their thing, then inflation hit, and suddenly he looked in a lot less of a secure position from the position of us in the future. Heath didn't know this and called an election in which he ran on the campaign of who governs Britain? Basically saying, is it going to be the politicians or is it going to be the unions? And the answer was a resounding, not you, Ted. And that's because he lost his touch as a Prime Minister. Although the party didn't chuck him out, although he didn't lose to his own party, he as a Prime Minister lost in a general election. He gambled everything and failed. And as a consequence, kind of lost his authority within the party too. So here, events didn't just cause a defenestration, they caused a dramatic reversal of fortune at the ballot box and allowed another party to win. Now, granted only by a small number of seats, granted a very small majority that was never really fully recovered, but it did mean that a Prime Minister that looked like he had the world at his feet, that was acting in a presidential manner in many ways, that seemed to have the authority and the power to run his own show without any input from cabinet, was revealed to have feet of clay. Events, dear boy, events. And so we come to Callaghan's missing of the vote. Callaghan, you've already seen a picture, here's another one, this one's in black and white. In 1976, he took over from Harold Wilson. I have a lot of time for Harold Wilson, he's in my box. Wait, do I have my box? I do! So my box, if I may, is a metaphysical box. Thank you to the sixth formers that created it for me. Look, it says Mr. A's Historical Box. And in it, I keep all my favourite figures from history. Some of them better than others. Russian history, shout out, that's Nicholas II, he has issues. There's Robespierre, I quite like Robespierre. There's Henry the Fat Eighth. I've got a lot of time for Henry the Eighth. He's a bit like Stalin, but not. Napoleon, because he's funny. Galen is a joke you don't get. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, make of him what you will. Nikita Khrushchev, yet to find a picture where he doesn't look utterly trolleyed on vodka. Churchill, believe it or not, is in my box. And there he is, Harold Wilson. Proof, if 'twere needed, that he's in my box. In case you're wondering, Joseph Lister, amazing sideburns. John Major, surprisingly enough, I have a lot of respect for the man as a Prime Minister, and Robert Koch, because of a joke in an old... That's me closing the box. The box is now shut. The box is closed. So, proof if 'twere needed, Harold Wilson is in... Is it Harold McMillan? I've got a sudden worry. Proof if 'twere needed that... he's in my box. I quite like him. But he resigned because he was getting ill, and he was replaced by James Callaghan. Now, by this point, Wilson was largely unpopular. He was seen as a bit outmoded, and we'll talk about why later in the course. Callaghan, on the other hand, had tremendous personal authority, and both sides of the party respected him. They didn't like him, but they respected him, and he got his own way. Remember that discussion on the IMF in 1976. At the height of his power in 1976, he was able to say the following at the Labour Party conference, that's him at the Labour Party conference, and get away with it. He said, the cosy world, which we were told would go on forever, where full employment, whoops, there's a comma there that shouldn't be, would be guaranteed by the stroke of a chancellor's pen, cutting taxes, deficit spending, that cosy world is gone. And he immediately set about doing un-Labour things, like muzzling the unions, like reducing government spending, like balancing budgets, and being really careful about what was spent where. And the interesting thing was, this was largely popular. And for 2 years, it worked. And in 1978, he had the option to call a general election he was widely tipped to win. But he didn't. He took a gamble and decided that no. He wasn't just going to scrape by. He was going to call an election after 5 years and then go on competency. And you'll remember from Unit 1, the power of competency in a general election campaign. He wants to campaign saying, look, we've not only done these things, we've seen them through. I haven't done this for political advantage. I'm doing it for the good of the country. And you can see where he was coming from. And he had such personal authority within the party that they went along with him. He was winning. 1978 to 1979 didn't quite go according to plan. Oops, that was a flash of something that shouldn't have come up. First of all, he went to an international conference at about the time when a series of general strikes were called, and we entered what is now known as the Winter of Discontent. That press conference, and it's a really bad version of it, and I do apologise, I couldn't find a better one, is the first of those two links. Click on it, it's about 2 minutes long, and you'll see him talking about what's happening in Britain. What's happening in Britain is there are a series of strikes, and it looks bad, really bad. Loads of businesses were closed, people had brownouts and blackouts, there wasn't enough power going around, and the unions looked like they were getting out of hand. Whether or not they were is a matter for a debate, and it doesn't need to detain us here. We're talking about the politics, not the history. And this is his response to that. Now, it's fairly measured, to be fair. He talks about it being a time of emergency, but there's no need to call in emergency powers. But the optics in the Caribbean, an international conference, he didn't have a choice where it was held, and as Prime Minister he should have attended, whilst the Winter of Discontent, I mean, it conjures images, right? Didn't look good. It got reported in the Sun newspaper, the role of the media in general election campaigns, as crisis? What crisis? And this led to a very successful and quite long Conservative election broadcast, which I've helpfully labelled for you as the second YouTube link. You don't have to watch it all, it's about 10 minutes long, but it's worth watching because it gives you an idea about how this played at home. So go and watch those two clips to understand how Callaghan wasn't going to win the 1979 election. He just wasn't, at least not on his own merits. He was going to lose as a Prime Minister. So pause the video, go watch those now. Okay, I'm going to assume you have watched those. Next on my list is Major Sleazy Cabinet. Now, you'll remember, Major is in my box. I quite like John Major. Not necessarily as a politician or a person, but as a manager and an effective commander of people. I have to respect what he did in 1992, and I have to respect what he dealt with afterwards. Major was having issues. We've talked about him before, the bastards. And basically, in 1995, he'd had enough of being undermined. And so, in this YouTube link that I have provided, he announced that he was going to resign as party leader. This could mean that he was going to be replaced as Prime Minister. And he said, if I am re-elected as party leader, I call upon my opponents to put up or shut up. Basically, to stop undermining him. Go watch that video, it's worth a watch. Okay, I'm assuming you've watched it now. Now, to be fair, John Major doesn't exactly cut a dynamic figure. Whilst I respect him, I recognise his failings. I could never be a John Major. I'm not dynamic myself, but I'm not a John Major. He is a grey man making a grey threat. And the threat was taken up. John Redwood, pictured below John Major, stood for election against him. And although he did not succeed, he got enough of a backing that it was clear there was a division in the Conservative Party. Furthermore, over the next 2 years, many cabinet ministers were revealed to have, well, scandals. This sounds familiar. Scandals where they were sleeping with people, where they were having affairs, whilst publicly saying that affairs were bad. There were no orgies this time, but there were dominatrixes, paid escorts, prostitution, corruption, dressing as Nazis to go to fancy dress costumes, that sort of thing. It looked bad. And John Major was also in the middle of an affair, but this was not known at the time, which might explain his lack of authority and ability to clamp down on his cabinet minister's bad behaviour. After all, they must have known he was with Edwina Currie, who was a cabinet minister. I think cabinet might have been aware. And this rather did for him. He wasn't ousted as Prime Minister. After all, why? The Conservatives knew they were going to lose. Why? Well, Tony Blair was behind this. His New Labour project was taking over. And he was a bullish leader of the opposition who kept embarrassing the government, arguably because the government kept giving him opportunities to do so. But still, he was embarrassing the government, and people kind of knew that he was going to win. And lo and behold, he did. And John Major was therefore the fall guy. He took the blame. Of course they kept him in position. He was a weak Prime Minister, trapped in his own government after 1995. There was nothing he could do to fix that. And that is another way events, dear boy, events can make a Prime Minister lose. Next, we have Cameron and the coalition. Now, on the face of it, David Cameron isn't a terribly strong Prime Minister. He's in a coalition. He has to run everything by his coalition partners, the Lib Dems. And there were several things he had to run by them and do that he didn't want to do, like holding an AV referendum in 2011, like failing to get the bombing of Assad after a chemical weapons attack in 2013 through Parliament, like he failed to reform political boundaries. We talked about that when we were talking about election situations, when we were talking about, when was it? First past the post. And the Boundaries Commission, he wanted to change it and it failed. And that would seem to suggest, on our basis so far, that David Cameron is a weak Prime Minister. But I want you to watch that video clip that's underneath him and Clegg going into number 10 for the first time as coalition leaders. He as Prime Minister and Nick Clegg as Deputy Prime Minister. Have a watch of that news report. It's from ITV. I was going to do the whole speech, but it takes too long. And it's fascinating to watch. It's about 10 minutes long, I think. Or did I do the 4-minute one? I can't remember. Don't worry. Go watch that video now. Pause the video and come back. I'll still be here when you've done. Okay, I'm going to assume you've watched that. And I'm going to assume you've seen the underlying steel of the man. And also how the coalition might actually have helped his authority as Prime Minister. After all, they'd undergone a coalition agreement. That meant that the Lib Dems weren't able to withdraw their support. He had a parliamentary majority. He had 306 seats, Lib Dems had 57. Between them, they had a commanding majority. If it was in the agreement, they had to agree to it. There was no chance that he could be outmanoeuvred by his cabinet colleagues. That gave him tremendous authority. Furthermore, he could do most of what he promised he was going to do. They agreed with the Lib Dems that government spending had to be brought under control after the economic crisis of 2007-2008. More on that in a moment. And as a consequence, he was able to push through measures that perhaps would have got more scrutiny and perhaps wouldn't have been possible had there not been a coalition. Certainly, even with a tiny minority, there would have been a majority rather. There would have been enough of a pushback that he would have failed to succeed in austerity. And he won them over to the argument. The Lib Dems have never repudiated austerity, and indeed in 2019 even said they would go back to it. So there's that. Collective ministerial responsibility meant that no matter what the Lib Dems thought privately, in public they had to support the Conservative manifesto promises. And the Conservatives were able to use the Lib Dems essentially as human shields. Anything that people didn't like, they could legitimately blame on the Lib Dems during the election campaigns. The Lib Dems were taken by surprise by this. They shouldn't have been, but they were. And it did for them. They took the blame for doing things they promised they wouldn't do, despite the fact it was part of the coalition agreement. And also, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act passed in 2011 meant that it lasted for a full 5 years. Cameron was never threatened internally by the government or externally by those he faced, because they couldn't be. And that's the mark of a strong Prime Minister. Nevertheless, he had to give some cabinet positions to people he didn't want, and to Nick Clegg in particular, and others. And what's your favourite political joke, you might remember? Nick Clegg, he said. And that's an interesting position to be in as a Prime Minister. He had to do that referendum that he didn't want to do, but he was able to run the campaign in such a way that he won. There was also no Salisbury Convention protecting his stuff going through the House of Lords, because there was no winning manifesto. And as a consequence, the House of Lords could stop anything that went through. And they did try to stop a number of things, which did frustrate him on a number of levels. And, yeah, he had to sort of devise a way of getting things through that was, well, they called it the Quad. Basically, I'm just reading from the textbook here, you can look it up yourself, it's on page 204. Cameron and Osborne, his Chancellor of the Exchequer, is number 2, with Nick Clegg and Danny Alexander, had to agree on anything they were going to do before it was put to the rest of Cabinet. Now, that generally meant that Cabinet would support it, but it does mean that there is an element of less power to Cameron than initially appears. from the coalition. The big question, does the coalition support his Prime Minister position, or did it tame him? There's a debate. There's a yes and a no. One thing is certain, when he was Prime Minister in 2015, he was able to gain a great deal because he'd won a general election, and this pretty much cemented his personal authority. However, those old divisions resurfaced over Europe, and we know how that ended. It ended with the referendum of 2016, and do I have it? Yes. This speech here, immediately after the result was made known. David Cameron gambled everything and lost. A bit like Ted Heath. A bit like James Callaghan. Almost like there's a trend developing. And yeah, go watch that resignation speech. It's fascinating. And it does explain, well, why David Cameron could also be seen as a Prime Minister who lost. The coalition allowed him to win, and then he gambled everything and lost. Go watch it. Pause this video. Okay, I think that's long enough. Hopefully you've had a chance to watch those two clips. They're worth it. Between them, I think they're about 15-20 minutes, so we're probably closing on an hour by now. I won't tarry too long. The next thing we need to look at is Prime Ministers who are more managers than leaders. I have a lot of time for managers. I explained this with John Major, but just to reiterate, I have a lot of time for people who do managerial things, who get what they want without ever actually having to ask for it. And so that means, grudgingly, in both cases I suppose, Gordon Brown and Theresa Human Rights for Optional May gain something of my respect. Gordon Brown was made Prime Minister as part of an agreement that he'd reached with Tony Blair back before they were in office the first time in 1997. Tony Blair took a decision to leave Cabinet. He took a decision to resign. He was well aware that the war in Iraq had made him unpopular. He was well aware that the 2005 election didn't really prove much. And he was well aware that despite being a good Chancellor, he delivered economic success. Stage was set for a good prime ministerial run. Cabinet were behind him. They were pleased to be rid of Tony. Now it didn't matter that what Tony wanted. Now they could have a proper cabinet government again. And in 2007 there was an economic crisis that hit the entire world, down to the subprime mortgage market in the United States. No one had complete control, but the first bank that went under, Bradford and Bingley, was in the UK. That's pretty much it. Gordon Brown, a former Chancellor who vaguely understood these sorts of things, did the method known as quantitative easing. And to be fair, he did manage to save the UK financial sector. But he spent a lot of money doing it. Not as much as other countries, and arguably prevented a worse recession. But that's for economists to discuss, and I don't really understand economics. So suffice to say, he did what most people around the world did, but got literally none of the credit. And so it was that slowly but surely, the strain began to tell. He had to balance his cabinet of people who disagreed about how best to proceed. There were those who wanted to go for a Blairite response, and those who said, well, Blairism's kind of dead, and Tony Blair is no longer with us, we can do what we like. And he had tried to balance that. And it led to, well, basically he learned from Tony Blair. He tried a Tony Blair approach and tried to dominate his cabinet, and it didn't work. Famously, of course, he threw fax machines, mobile phones, telephones, folders, tables, desks, and a computer screen at various people in his cabinet in an effort to get them to do as he wished. These things got leaked. He ended up going on antidepressants. Then he did that smile thing, and he lost the next general election, being roundly blamed by everybody for the response to the economic crisis, despite the fact that it worked. Events, dear boy. Events. And personality, I suppose. May, the textbook says, unfortunately, but she totally chose this, decided to take power at a point with the Brexit shenanigans unresolved, with her party divided between those who wanted out of Europe and those who wanted to remain within it. This meant her cabinet had to be a carefully, finely tuned balancing act between Remainers and those who wanted to leave. We talked about this in the cabinet sheet, the A3 sheet that I've set you, where I've asked you to give an example of a cabinet based on balance. May's balance kinda worked and contained the divisions a bit. The fact she lasted as long as she did and lost an election, really, I mean, she won, but with a massively reduced majority. She was tipped to win 441 seats, and she didn't, and had to rely on the DUP to maintain a majority, which was tenuous at best. So when people say, but Labour didn't win the election either, no, they didn't. But what they did do was prevent the government having the majority it needed. May never got a chance to run as a Thatcherite-style Prime Minister, despite early noises to that end. Instead, she was forced to act as a manager, and the fact she lasted from 2017 to 2019 with constant government defeats, constant backbiting, constant catcalls, leaks, and negative stories in the press is nothing short of amazing. And it's not down to a weak opposition, it's down to her strength as a manager, her ability to keep her cabinet together and to do as she wished. And I've already spoken about that in the example about how a Prime Minister wins. But events, dear boy, events. Brexit did her in. It was an impossible balancing act. She couldn't do it. She had no personal skin in the game. She had no personal view about how it would be best to proceed. And as a consequence, she lost her job and was ousted and replaced by a Brexiteer, Boris Johnson, in 2019. So what about Johnson? And this is as far as I'll go. I'll go slightly over 30 minutes, that's fine. What about Johnson? Well, Johnson was able to take ownership of Brexit in 2019 with his Get Brexit Done campaign. It was oven ready, just wanging it in the microwave. And it worked. People went for it. Boris Johnson had been widely connected with the Leave campaign since 2016. So when he promised to do it, people followed. His weird, non-leadership effort in 2016 was forgotten. His strange habits were glided over because he'd identified himself with a particular cause. And there it might have ended. But for events, dear boy, events. In 2020, his personal power took a bit of a upward tick. He'd already purged his party, which could have ended his political career. That's a dangerous move. But he kind of got away with it, because then coronavirus hit. And that nearly did him in too. He'd resisted a lockdown. He talked about taking off the Clark Kent glasses and maintaining a superhero of capitalism approach, where herd immunity will be achieved by letting everybody get the disease, which isn't terribly popular when old people are dying and they're your granny. The lockdown was badly timed. The policies were not good. And yet he survived. Why? Well, he himself got coronavirus. I mean, obviously he did. He went around shaking the hands of patients with coronavirus. Obviously he got it. I mean, duh. But it gave him tremendous personal authority. The event transformed him from a bit of a joke, actually, to almost a symbol. And as a consequence, he gained tremendous personal ratings. As you see from the image here, he owned getting coronavirus. Image here at the top. He owned getting coronavirus and turned it into a bit of a political coup. People trusted him more, even though he lied all the time. And people went, well, now's not the time to question his leadership. He might die. That's just not cricket. It's not what we do. And he played that personal sympathy incredibly well. Say what you like about Boris Johnson, he is a very good political animal. Oh, but then there was Brexit. And again, he crested that wave successfully. Despite having said that they got an agreement and then not having an agreement, he didn't suffer the political consequences. Rather, he was able to use the press to argue that he'd given the greatest Christmas present ever, a Brexit agreement. The night before Brexmas, as the Sun said, as Tier 4 spread at the end of last year. It diverted attention away from government failings at just the right moment, gave him the news comments that he needed and the headlines, and actually transformed and enhanced his political standing within the cabinet, despite the fact that everyone agrees he doesn't have a head for detail, he doesn't care for meetings, he's not that bothered how things are run, and has no ideas of his own. Everyone agrees these things. These things have been regularly leaked, but as a consequence, his personal authority remains untouched. He is the Heineken of the Conservative Party. He reaches the part of the electorate that others cannot. And then the vaccination programme in early 2021. This is the latest available chart showing how many people have been vaccinated in different groups. And that's staggering. It's going well. Why? Because the NHS is in charge, and the NHS has been preparing for something like this for years, and they're very good at it. But it means that government ministers can take credit for that. Trouble is, Zahawi, remember Zahawi? I've mentioned him before. Zahawi's not terribly well known, and although he can take credit for it, no one really knows who he is. Matt Hancock, although he can take credit for it, everyone knows who his boss is. And that's Boris Johnson. And he, as Prime Minister, is able to lap up the success of things that he had no part in. Trust me, he had no part in. But it works. His political instincts mean that, well, as Prime Minister, the events seem to be being used and harnessed in a way that, well, no other Prime Minister that we've mentioned so far has managed. So although I've entitled this How a PM Loses, and I keep making reference to events, here's a Prime Minister that should have lost by every other metric, but for whom events have proved a saving grace. And that is why I include him at the end here to bring it up to date. In other words, what keeps Boris Johnson Prime Minister? Well, events, dear boy. Events. And that brings us to the end of this. Slightly over 30 minutes, but I'm hoping you can deal with it, plus all those video clips. If it bleeds over into another lesson, that's not a major problem. You'll see why when I do that lesson. Now, on Tuesday, I said that we'd have an assessment, the first lesson back. I'm going to set that up for the second lesson today. So you'll have half term to prepare for it, and then I'll set it as an assessment, an actual assessment, on that first lesson back. So I don't expect you to write the answer over half term. Just prepare it, check your notes, put everything in the right order, make sure you've got what you need, and ask any questions you may have on our Thursday meeting, so that you're ready and prepared for after half term. Other than that, thank you, if you have been, for watching. I hope that this has been useful to you, and I'm hoping that it's providing what you need to understand cabinet government and the powers of the Prime Minister, and how a Prime Minister wins and loses. Have a lovely rest of your day. I'll see you in the second video today when I'm talking about how to answer a practice question, 2 practice questions, which I'll set for after half term. See you around.